Hello and welcome to the Your Financial Pharmacist Real Estate Investing Podcast, a show all about empowering pharmacists to achieve financial freedom through real estate investing. I'm Nate Hedrick, and each week, my co-host David Bright and I explore stories from pharmacists all over the country who are achieving their real estate goals while maintaining a meaningful career in pharmacy. Whether you're a first-time investor or a seasoned pro, we're here to provide education and inspiration about the world of real estate. Please note, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, good, thanks. How you doing, man?
Good. So I know that the most of our audience is probably aware, but if you're not, we are not just podcast co-hosts, right? We are investment co-hosts of sorts.
Yeah. It's been fun. We wrapped up a flip that we worked on together this past winter, which was a lot of fun. And so I think that, working with another person in a real estate investment, whether that's in like a true business partnership or whether it's different people bringing different things to the table in a brainstorming or accountability or coaching or whatever that looks like, there's opportunities to push ahead, to learn and to grow with and from others. And sometimes even to pool capital in like a lending relationship or something like that when a project may be out of reach. And so many ways that you can work together with another real estate investor. And I don't know that we talk about that enough, but that's where we're going today, right?
Absolutely. I think, if you remember at all, we had Tan Trong back on episode 42 and way back on episode 4. And so today we were lucky enough to get his business partner from back in the day, Dylan Koch, on the episode, and just really awesome investor, just like Tan.
Yeah, both got to start in the residential space. So just Nate, like you and I do, but these guys, they worked right out of the gates, right out of pharmacy school, worked super hard and just crushed it doing a ton of real estate investing early on as they were just brand new pharmacists.
Yeah. And so Dylan is a pharmacist. He is an investor. He is local Ohio boy like myself, and just a really all around great guy that has a great vision for real estate and how it can fit into your financial plan, support a family, support a wealthy life, and just, again, really a great person to have on the show.
Yeah, I think another thing that's interesting about this story is that Dylan and Tan, they've gone their separate ways in their investing since the early days when they got started. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? In this case, they're both still great friends. They just went to different real estate strategies that they wanted to pursue with their investing. And so, as Dylan mentions, it can be super good to go into a real estate partnership or any kind of relationship, lending, whatever that would be, knowing that it might not last for forever. For whether that's good reasons or bad reasons, whatever that would be, but having a plan in place in case dividing and getting out ever makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And again, it's great to hear that they could use that partnership to benefit each other and then move on to better and different goals, right? As time moves on. And I just think that's super inspiring. And again, Dylan in his own right is doing some amazing stuff now in the real estate space. So wanted to bring him on, talk about those things, to see how you can go from, student pharmacist to new investor and beyond. So hope you guys enjoy it as much as we enjoy talking to Dylan, and we'll take you to the episode. Hey, Dylan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really excited to be here. We reached out. I know you and I have been, we've talked a long time ago, and then we reconnected recently, and it's great to have you on to talk about all things real estate investing. So why don't we jump right in, give everybody a little background on your pharmacy story and what got you where you are today.
Sure. I went to the University of Cincinnati. I did 2 years of undergrad and then 4 years of grad school. I graduated in 2017. After that, I worked for Kroger for the longest time. I was a floater for a while, then got staffed, ended up managing a store. And as I'm sure we'll talk about later, I eventually left Kroger and I went to a mail order facility. And that was basically, so I wasn't working 50, 60 hours a week. I worked 40, and the rest of the time was built on the real estate business.
Well, that's a nice transition then to the real estate story. So can you walk us through what got you into real estate and your why behind your real estate investing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the why to start was basically financial freedom. I don't have the ambitions to be the next Warren Buffett or billionaire or anything like that, but I do want basically enough passive income to provide for myself and for my family so I can do what I want, when I want, with who I want. And that was the main goal, right? You type in the financial calculators at age 65, but I wanted to basically move that up to 35 or as quickly as I could to just enjoy life and travel and do not. How I got here was when I graduated pharmacy school, the first personal finance book I ever read was Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover. Mm-hmm. And I was very much following the baby steps, paying off debt aggressively. When I graduated pharmacy school, I had around $72,000 in student loan debt. From what I understand is from the national average is still good compared to the median.
Yeah, you're low.
But I was paying $2,000 to $3,000 a month to try to pay that down as quick as I could. I was living with my first year of school. I was living with 4 other roommates. So I could my living expenses were pretty low, had a paid off car. Then as I was, on these floater routes that you'd go between stores, like driving, I eventually listened to Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. And you basically have these 2 different schools of thought, especially when it comes to debt and what that kind of looks like. But just doing the math and penciling it out from a return on investment standpoint, real estate made the most sense to me at the time. So I dove down that rabbit hole as quick as I could. Of course, Bigger Pockets, ABCs of real estate investing, all the purple books. And I had a realtor at the gym I went to, and I basically said, hey, this is what I'm looking for. Can you help me? And so in June of 2018, which is still pretty much a seller's market, I acquired a duplex where I lived in one unit, rented out the other, and was able to drastically even reduce my living expenses even more to what they were even with the roommates. And so that was in June of 2018. And if you guys want, I can go into some of those numbers.
Yeah, I want to stop for just a second, though, because I think house hacking is huge, right? Because a lot of people talk about it or haven't heard of it, right? And everywhere in between. And so how did you actually find out that okay, this is the way I want to jump into real estate investing? You decided it was for you, but what made house hacking the fit to kind of be the first place to go?
It just seemed like the most logical next step at the time. I mean, I was young. I was 24 years old. I didn't care about having roommates or anything like that. And it seemed like the lowest risk at the time. So I still had a place to live. So it wasn't any different paying rent to me. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess you do have the fears of what if something goes wrong, but I'm very much I can know 80% of the information and jump in and then figure out the rest along the way. And so I don't know, at the time, it just seemed like a low risk way to get my feet wet and start.
I love it. I love that. When we hear about risk reduction, I think that resonates with pharmacists, right? Yeah. And I think pharmacists are also very spreadsheet oriented. So I'm sure there's people that really want to know the numbers on this. So can you walk us through a little bit about what you paid for the property, the rent from the other side, how they compared to your mortgage, and what your costs ended up being?
Yeah. So I did the 3.5%, FHA down payment loan. The house was $272,000. So I think it was $10K out of pocket when it's all said and done. It was around there. Principal and interest was $1,000 a month. Taxes $300 a month. Insurance $100 a month. About this property though is I would never do this now, but it didn't have separate utilities. So all the utility, even though it was a duplex, I had to pay for all the utilities, water, electric. And then you have PMI, the private mortgage insurance, when you don't have that high of a down payment. So all in all, I think it was around $1,850 a month was my all-in cost. And I was renting the other side for $1,500 a month. So my living expenses, with a pharmacist salary, were $350 a month total. So, I mean, at the time, I felt like I was stealing, right? It was a way for me to pack cash a lot. Eventually, with that same property, though, I ended up refinancing into what they call an 80-10-10 loan. Mm-hmm. So 80% first mortgage, 10% second mortgage, and then 10% equity. Because I had made some improvements, I put on a new roof, put in new windows, and it just had natural appreciation at the time. So I was able to lower those expenses even a little bit further and get rid of PMI because no one lender saw that I was 80% levered or less. Right. So that helped a lot too.
That's awesome. So you get to basically move out or move into a place and live for not free, but just about as close as you can get while building equity in a market that's appreciating. I mean, that's the dream. That's awesome.
Yeah. Tax benefits as well. Yeah. I mean, it worked. In hindsight, it worked out better than I could have imagined at the time.
And how long did you stick with that property before moving on to the next phase?
So I lived in that property for about 3 years. I did end up selling that property. And for listeners too, I believe the federal tax code is if you live in a property 2 of 5 years, mm-hmm. then those are tax-free gains you get when you sell.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I know that property is worth more than what I sold it for today too. So take that with a grain of salt. But that purchase was in June of 2018. And when I graduated, I made good friends with a past guest of yours, Ton, and we basically formed a partnership together where we decided that we had similar ambitions, we had similar goals, that if we see something, again, like lowering our risk, it felt like at the time to have someone else involved with half the money, half the work. So we ended up buying another duplex in Cincinnati in August of 2018. And then we ended up buying another duplex in January of 2019. So there's three duplex purchases for me that were between June and January.
Wow.
So about 6 month time frame there. But then eventually you run out of money quickly in real estate when you try to acquire properties at a fast pace.
Yeah, that's like my first thought, right? So I'll stop for a second. If you mentioned Ton, we love Ton. He's been on the show twice, episode 4 and episode 42 for everybody else that wants to check that out. Big shout out to Ton. And but my first thought is, okay, so you bought a place and that 10 grand, like I get that, but then you bought 2 more. How are you financing that so quickly? That's awesome.
So it really was saving every penny I could, working a ton of overtime, and having very low living expenses.
Yeah.
I didn't have a car payment. I didn't have a significant other at the time. I have a dog. I didn't have any responsibilities a lot of people have when they're older. Mm-hmm. So my living expenses were so low that I was able to just stockpile cash. And Tom will tell you the same thing. Living expenses very low, very frugal scenario where we were just able to stockpile cash from our jobs and working a ton of overtime.
I think that's huge, especially for our listeners who are about to graduate from pharmacy school or just graduated from pharmacy school, depending on when you're listening. And you're thinking about, well, I'm now making this pharmacist salary. I can go get the bigger house. I can go get bigger rent payment. Like if you just do a little bit of this work up front, you can really set yourself up for success down the road by cutting expenses early on. And then you can figure the rest out later. But I love that. I think that's a really good point.
One of the things you mentioned too about partnerships. So we have some guests that come on and they say that, having a partner helps to just make it easier to jump in because you have someone else to run the race with you. Other people would say, well, you bought 2 duplexes together. Why didn't you just each buy 1 duplex so that then there's no drama down the line if you guys go your separate ways at some point? Like it just makes it a lot simpler to own your own and own it 100%. So kind of with that tension between those 2 philosophies, where did you land and what made you decide to jump into a partnership with your early investing?
Yeah. And this is going to be situation dependent on every case by case basis. But what was comfortable for me is we had those conversations of what do we want this portfolio to look like in 5 years? What do we want it to look like in 10 years? So we had similar ideas of, and then not only what we wanted to look like in 10 years, but how are we going to do it? Right. And we were so alike in our goals and ambitions that I had no trouble. I trusted him to do, if he ran the numbers, I wouldn't even sure, let's buy it. I think he would say the same thing for me too. So there's a lot of trust in the other person. And that goes back to our relationship, in pharmacy school too. It's not like we just met and we're like, let's do this. Right. We had a prior relationship to that. As we'll probably get into though, our partnership has since dissipated. Mm-hmm. It did end very, he's we're still one of my closest friends. He's a groomsman in my wedding. All said and done, Tom and I still love each other very much. But the one thing I will say on this partnership idea is it doesn't matter how aligned you are at the beginning, is life does change. Tom's moved on to commercial doing some other stuff. And I've really stayed on the residential side. But my goal here is to build a wholesaling / this real estate investment company so I can acquire other stuff for myself too. So if I had give any advice on the partnership front is not only make sure you're aligned at the beginning, but still have those documents in place regardless. If that's operating agreements, if something does happen, this is spelled out from the beginning, this is what we agreed upon. And don't have your strengths and weaknesses be the exact same. Mm-hmm. And Ton will be the first one to tell you this. I'd say we are almost too much alike when it comes to running the numbers or our risk tolerance or what we are good at. To be frank, if you see me with a hammer, that's probably a bad thing. I'm not a handy guy by any means. And so we both feel comfortable running the numbers, running Excel sheets, doing comparable sales, that kind of stuff when it comes to real estate negotiation. But where neither of us are handy people, probably don't like confrontation the most, dealing with headache tenants or whatnot. So property management, neither of us like to do. So if you're going to partner with somebody, just make sure your strengths and weakness complement each other versus are congruent with each other.
And is it too much to lead you with? But I imagine you also set up some stuff in advance, right? So that when this dissolution happened, right, and you started to sell off some of the properties, everything was lined up in advance, so it wasn't contentious, right?
Correct. Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head with that. I probably couldn't have said that any better.
Yeah, it just because I feel like some people go into these partnerships and think, well, I know you, I trust you, we'll figure out the rest later. But the best thing you can do is set it up from the beginning so that when X, Y, and Z happens, you know exactly what path you're going to
Yep.
walk down and how it's going to look, so that nobody is left, holding the bag.
Yep. And I mean, life happens and life changes. Like as much as we were aligned at the beginning, that was still 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And so like things do change, and just keep that in mind when you're starting that path.
I mean, think about where you were 5 years before you bought your first investment property, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great mental model to use when you're doing something like that.
That's huge.
Yeah, and you mentioned operating agreement also. Like there are some standard business documents that walk you through some of these kind of things, right? So if you were to talk with an attorney and formally set up a company, they would kind of force you to answer some of these questions. So is that your experience?
Yep. Yeah. And Ton and I, and like specifically, we network a lot with a lot of local investors. And so, our CPA recommended us to a real estate attorney, right? So we feel comfortable going to them, and they've done this before. So they've seen every scenario that you can think of. So relying on those people who have years of experience, like that have seen all this stuff, they know what questions to ask, how to set things up appropriately. And don't even ask yourself if you should be LC, taxed as an S Corp versus a C Corp, all that kind of stuff. They let the experts handle that. So
That's great advice.
Yeah, and that was my exact experience too. Is like when going to an attorney that's been through that has helped people go through, like they gave, here's all the questions you need to talk with your future business partner about. Bring me back your answers, but take a few hours and talk this through. Like what happens if, and yeah, having that all not only figured out, but written down in advance is such a huge deal, so that if something goes sideways or people grow apart or whatever, you're covered. And it's just major stress reduction.
Yeah. But if the people, the listeners out there who might be thinking like partnership or not, I feel like pharmacists they like to have control a lot of the times. I don't know if that's a correct stereotype, but I would say don't do it then at the start. But like if you can give up a little autonomy and you want to reduce your risk, and then that risk is carried 50-50, and that gets you to at least do your first deal, then I would say do it and go for it.
Yeah, David and I talk about that sometimes too, where like every once in a while, like we even say like 10% of the deals you buy are probably going to be stinkers. Like it's not going to work out. There's going to be a problem you don't foresee. And so if you can share that risk with somebody else, when you do catch that bad one, it doesn't hurt so much because you're sharing that risk, you're sharing that workload. And I think that's.
Yeah. I mean, the perfect example, that first duplex that we bought together, the plumbing broke in the middle of the night on one of those like winter days. And so I got the call, but the next day I had to work. Ton didn't, so he was able to take care of it, right? So it's just like stuff like that.
So you mentioned earlier that you've kind of made the jump in pharmacy jobs, and now even from there, can you tell us kind of more about your most recent jump into real estate full-time? What kind of threshold made you feel like you were able to do that, and how that's gone?
Yeah, no, great question. So I went full-time in real estate in September of 2021. Prior to that, we had built up a portfolio of 13-ish units, all between single family and like duplexes, essentially. Upon that, like the disbursement of those, we were sitting on some cash because, we sold a lot of stuff. Since that time in September, I've built it back up to about 6 wholesale deals, 1 flip, and 7 units to keep for myself. And so that's been in a frame of a little less than a year. The reason I was able to do that is because 1, I had a decent stockpile of cash that I felt safe with. And then 2, my now wife is a pharmacist as well. So, right. And we still live pretty modestly. So to be completely transparent, her income covers our living expenses. So before we have kids and before I have these extra responsibilities of life, it's either now or never. If I want to do it. So I jumped ship, and I don't regret doing so. It is one of those things where, you can read about it in a book that people tell you it's a roller coaster ride, but you really don't know it until you feel it. It definitely is. And there was one thing I was going to add on to that, but it'll probably come back to me here in a second.
So you mentioned you had several wholesale deals. Is that kind of the core of your business, where you're looking for these off-market deals and then keeping the good ones for yourself and wholesaling off the others? Is that the model, or what is the goal with the business?
That is exactly right. And
okay.
And I real quick, I'm going to backtrack because I remember what I was going to say. Like going the transition from pharmacist to full-time real estate investor. There are 2 main reasons. I no longer liked going into work every day. It was a big part of that. And two, I guess I have financial goals that are probably bigger than what a non-scalable income can provide, right? So I know all the pharmacists out there know that you're not max when you start, but it's pretty much like a sharp peak up from intern to somewhat of a very low slope plateau,
Right.
From an income perspective. And so I've seen it work, and I've seen people take these businesses, and they know that some of them, depending on how big you want to do, they can do 6 figures a month in profit. And then they use the wholesale the rest, or wholesale the rest, keep the best motto is what I was kind of aiming for. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm still a one-man crew. I have a couple of VAs that pull some lists for me. And I did end up joining another mastermind. Shout out to, if people are familiar with Bigger Pockets, Ryan Dossey's been on a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
And he runs a mastermind program called Create Cash Flow, or CCF for short. So I joined that. It cost me a decent chunk of change to join that mastermind. But that was really like the spark that got me to how to pull the right list. What does the copy look like on the mailers? How do they run their numbers differently? The accounting that goes behind everything that's behind not only real estate investing, but running a business behind it.
Right.
Yes, you can probably figure out all that on your own with YouTube and books, but decided to pay the money up front to basically just jump that learning curve. And it's allowed me to do, and not a lot, but 7 units and a couple wholesales in 6 months, 7 months. So it's been well worth it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I'd say it's quite a bit. Yeah. And as someone who has sent out some mailers with just YouTube knowledge, I can tell you it's not a good, I've done exactly one wholesale deal ever, and barely.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. And I did end up getting my real estate license, like agent license as well, not with the intent to sell single family homes in the suburbs, but for access to data, access to deals, to properties, was the main goal behind that.
Yeah, you could also do some referrals if you wanted to too, depending on the leads that you get. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And there's been one where, I was like, I can offer you X for your house, which is my cash price. They were no, like, I want retail, I want 100,000. I'm like, okay, well, I can probably get you that. I'll list it for you if you'd like. And we've had 2 of those that's worked out that way.
That's great. What a great model. I love it. And I think that goes back to what you were talking about earlier about the rich dad, poor dad mindset. And I just remember there's a chapter in there that talks about like being an E, right? Being an employee, and that it's great. You make, and people have done it for generations. You make a steady income, you have great job security, but there's nothing else, right? And I think you had that, you clearly exemplify that, where you're talking about stepping away from just that stuck paycheck every single month and trying to accelerate that in a different direction. I think that's awesome.
Yeah. And I recognize I'm in a very fortunate situation where my living expenses, like, I probably would not have made that jump if I didn't have my wife's income to help support that. I would have needed more passive income, more units before I felt comfortable doing that.
But who knows, if it all goes well, right? Then she can leave in a little while, and then you can both just hang out and do it.
Yeah. And those are the conversations that we now have, right? Like, if, once we get to X number, not of units, but X numbers of cash flow, then that's what we can talk, we can have those conversations.
So with today's market, though, so today's interest rates, today's housing market, it's obviously on fire. Even still, where's your focus at? Is it still the same game, or has your game plan shifted?
Great question. And I actually love macroeconomics. I love like going down those rabbit holes and following the Fed, their dot plots, like that kind of stuff. And so we can literally talk for hours about that stuff. But not to be like a bear with anything, but I do think we're going to see a recession probably in the next like 6 to 12 months. Like, not financial advice by any means on any of this, but I do think it's very like local dependent to your market. And I can speak Cincinnati dependent. And I think supply and demand trumps monetary policy when it comes to most things. So yes, they're probably going to raise interest rates another 75 points next month. But if there's still 100 buyers for one house, then you're still going to get deals. And in fact, like June and going into July, some of our marketing has even done better, because I feel like this current environment has other people very tentative, right? And then so I have less competition now. And on the flip side of that, I think sellers are like, oh, I better sell now before my houses dip down like they did in 2008. And so that has actually caused even more opportunity in the current market than it has in the past 6 months.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing more listings in our area. So I think that could be
Yeah.
that people are thinking now is the time to sell. Like is this shifting from a buyer's market to seller's market? But it sounds like one of the things that you've done to help with that is you've become a realtor. You've got access to all the data, and so you can see how quickly houses are moving, days on market. Like you can get into those statistics, and rather than just, well, I talked with my neighbor and it feels kind of like this, like you're able to get at the really good data, which also feels very pharmacist like.
Very much so. Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. Like pharmacists love to spreadsheet analyze, right? And do all that kind of stuff. And you can get very nerdy with this kind of data too. But the days on market going up a little bit, prices, seeing price declines, a house that used to get $30,000 over asking with appraisal gap coverage and waiving inspections, they're probably still going to get pretty close to list and one or two offers. And the pocket that I target is probably a 250K or less. Right. And so I think some of those more upper scale, like 500, 600,000, those are ones that get hit by interest rate hikes the most. Sure. Right. So if you can stay in a certain pocket, that's probably going to be popular the majority of the time, you're again just reducing your risk. And if you can buy a house or a property, whatever it may be, an income producing property after you account for all those expenses at 50 to 60% of what it's worth, then I don't care what the environment is, it's probably still a deal.
And so to clarify for people too, part of your perspective on this is in wholesaling. So you're buying houses and you're selling the contract or you're listing them, but you're not doing as much like rehab within a house, kind of house flip type work. Is that correct?
Correct. So they've done about 6 wholesales, and that's again like flipping paper essentially is what it is. I will say that wholesaling is popular, especially in the newbies, because it's low hanging fruit. You don't need a lot of money to get started, and you can have low risk. But I would argue that wholesaling, it should be one of the last things that an investor takes on, because you have to know how to run comps, how to run rehab numbers, how to negotiate with sellers. So it requires a skill set more than I bought it for 50 and I sold it for 100. I think a lot of the stuff out there makes it sound more appealing than it actually is. Have done one flip. I can say I'm not a fan of flipping all that much. If you could wholesale place and make a $10,000 spread, or flip one and make, I don't know, 30, I'm probably still going to take the contract, just because even though like less time, less risk, less headache is really what comes into it. Unless there's people that if that's their skill set, like I told you earlier, if you see me with a hammer, that's a bad thing. I am still very much learning all the rehab side of things. Like I have taken on a couple BRRRR projects that I'm working on refinancing now. And some of those interest rate hikes have changed the math. But luckily when you underwrite those deals, like I don't underwrite with 3.5% interest rates on a rental. Like if you can underwrite at 5.5, 6, even 7% where you think they might go and it still cash flows, it shouldn't scare you away from the deal, in my opinion.
Yeah. And that's kind of where I was going with the flip question too, is you're talking about the market. One of the things that I'm hearing is people afraid that the market may drop. And if they're trying to think through like, well, I'm going to buy this house, it's going to take me 6 months to rehab it and I'm going to sell it. But hey, the market's gone up 20% a year. So I can expect that it'll keep going. It sounds like you're not necessarily in that camp.
No. And I would be very wary, and like their interest rates are probably going to go up, which is probably going to affect housing a little bit. Again, if you can buy a place for 100, it's worth 300 and you got to put in 50K. That is a different story than if it's worth 300, you're buying it for 250 and you have to put in 40, right? It depends on how big that margin is and how comfortable you feel running those numbers. Like specifically in Cincinnati, a lot of the houses are 1920 or older. So you're going to run into more issues than you see than the 1970s, 1980s builds, where you just have to account for more in a miscellaneous or over budget category when you're running these numbers.
No, absolutely. And although I've also had a 70s house, it was a real doozy. So yeah, the doozies come in all shapes and sizes and ages. Absolutely. But I know what you mean. Like knowing the housing stock, knowing what kind of problems to expect, like there's a lot of things that can go wrong in a house flip. And yeah, if you're not accounting for all that, if you're not underwriting that well, it's a easy way to get hurt. So from a risk standpoint, like you're talking about, the ability to wholesale a house, to essentially just pass it off to another investor and work out a finder's fee for that. Like there's a lot less risk in that model, and that enables you to focus more time on getting more deals and building that machine that you're doing to just find deals constantly.
And a war chest for like if you want to talk about, if you want to scale quickly, right? The Burr method, in my opinion, is one of the best ways to do that. So if you can go in and have a stockpile of cash, do the rehab and not flip it, but then refinance out and get the majority, if not all of your money back, then you can then redeploy that. Your velocity of money goes up a lot. So if you want the opportunity to scale, you don't need hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that.
Yeah, I think the Burr method has come up a couple of times. So for those not as familiar with the method that are listening, could you walk someone through just very quickly and basically what is a Burr method?
Yeah. So if you follow Bigger Pockets, I think Brandon Turner is the one that, came up with the acronym, but the strategy has been around for a long time, where you basically buy a property, you rehab the property, you refinance the property, rent it out, and then repeat. So BRRR. And so for this is an example, this is our best one. And it was our very first Burr property. And we'll probably never get one like this again because it was good because we almost didn't know what we were doing at the beginning. But it was a place in Northern Kentucky. We bought it for like $22,000. It was pretty run down. We ended up putting 60 grand into it. So you're in for 80. Mm-hmm. It came back and it appraised at like 160, I think. Nice. 150, 160. And then so the bank, what they'll do, since you own this house, they'll write you a check on the refinance for typically 70 to 75% of what that house is worth. Yep. So we were able to walk away from closing, getting paid like 20 grand to own a cash flowing rental. Right. So that's just what I'm talking about. If you have the ambition to scale and like recycle your money, it's one of the best methods, in my opinion, to go out there and do that.
I love it. With what you're building so quickly, I'm curious, especially seeing, like, I think listeners that have listened to the last several episodes have heard Tan's story of jumping into the commercial space. Mm-hmm. You're building a machine with wholesaling and Burr method and residential. Does the future look like pivoting over to commercial? Does the future look like staying in residential, or why one versus the other?
Good question. And I would say that commercial is definitely like the numbers are bigger and everything they tell you is like, I won't say easier because I don't know, but like the tenant mix is probably easier. If you can get in that triple net style stuff where the tenant takes care of everything, you're not getting really phone calls, and you can place one tenant and get, 7-figure deals in some of these worlds. That could easily be on the table. But I guess what for me personally was I saw the roadmap on how to do the residential scaling business model because of that mastermind I'm in. And so I don't want to build too many bridges at once. So I just wanted to focus on getting this to the point where, I'm not working on it 40, 50 hours a week. I'm working on it maybe 5 to 10, and I can hire out those people. And then I can take that money that I'm stockpiling and then use that maybe for commercial deals down the road. So I'm not saying it's not on the table. It's just not what I'm focusing on at this time, because I feel like I've been, that squirrel syndrome where I'm like, oh, I should do Airbnb. I should do multifamily. I should do commercial. Right. And so I just need to sit down, focus, and like one thing at a time until I feel comfortable with where it's at, and then kind of diversify.
Yeah. I love that classic Brandon Turner analogy about building multiple bridges.
Such a good one.
Right.
I say that, but I'm also trying to stand up my first Airbnb right now. So.
It's true though. Like if you're trying to get to one island, you start building a bridge, you give up halfway and start another bridge, you're never going to get there. And you're just going to have a whole bunch of half finished bridges. So I think It's great what you're talking about, focusing. Yeah. Like you said, there's 1,000 different directions you could go. So I think that staying focused makes a lot of sense. So I want to switch over to our final infusion questions, Dylan. 3 questions we ask every guest on our show. Very first one is the same as always. What's one tangible strategy that you use to make sure that your investing works hand in hand with your career as a pharmacist?
Good question. The best way I can answer that, the best that helped me at the beginning, was try to network with people who have done it in your local market. There's probably a Bigger Pockets meetup. There's probably a RIA like event somewhere, and go there and talk to people who have done it in your market. And that's how I've made a lot of the connections here. Like I mentioned earlier, CPA, lawyer, handyman, plumber, electrician. Like if these are your unanswered questions, someone there is going to have your answers.
Love it.
No, I absolutely agree. I find that those meetups are super inspiring too. Like if you're just stuck, that really helps you to get going.
Yeah, 100%.
So what's one resource that's been most helpful to you in your real estate journey, whether that's a book, podcast, person, author, website, whatever that would be?
I have to go Bigger Pockets. I pretty much listened to every podcast episode that they had, all the way from Josh Dorkin to, and now they have so many, right? Like they have the new On the Market 1, 2 that I can nerd out with. But their calculators online, their forums, it's a big resource. And I'd say if there's one thing, it's all encompassing.
Yeah.
You could get lost for hours down that rabbit hole. So,
yep. All right. And then what's one piece of advice that you'd give to a pharmacist that's contemplating a start in real estate investing?
If you're even thinking about starting, get to the point where you feel comfortable pulling the trigger and then just do it. Because like you can read all the books, you can read all the forums, listen to the podcast and have all the answers. But until you go and actually do it, it's not going to get ingrained into your head. It's kind of like practicing pharmacy. Like you can take all the tests, but until you're practicing, it's different, right? So it's the same thing with real estate.
I love it. If people want to reach out, talk more with you, where can people find you?
Facebook's probably the easiest. Just my first and last name. You can just DM me anytime. And my email. It's probably not on there, but just DM me. And if you want to talk, I'll talk.
Perfect. We'll put it in the show notes so people can reach out. Well,
yeah, absolutely.
Dylan, really appreciate you coming on the show today. It's been awesome talking. I'm sure we'll see much more from you in the future. And again, just really appreciate you sharing all your great wisdom with the audience.
No, thanks for having me. This was great. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you like what you heard on today's show, please leave us a review and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, know someone that would make a good guest, or want to connect with Nate or David, head on over to yfprealestate.com and join the growing YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. As we conclude this week's episode of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. Have a great rest of your week.